Marie Louise d'Orléans, born on March 26, 1662, was the daughter of Philippe I, Duke of Orleans, and Henriette of England. Her birth was an event of considerable importance to the French royal family. The House of Orleans, cadet branch of the Bourbons, was a significant fixture in the French court, and Marie Louise, though not directly in line for the throne, was expected to play an important role in the complex web of alliances and dynastic politics that dominated 17th century Europe. From the very beginning, her life was marked by intrigue and expectation. Her father, Philippe I, Duke of Orleans, was the younger brother of King Louis XIV of France. Though Philippe's marriage to Henriette of England was politically motivated, their union was a relatively affectionate one, and they had a close relationship despite the many challenges of court life. Henriette, who was the daughter of King Charles I of England, was a lady of English royal blood, and her marriage to Philippe was part of the broader Bourbon and Stuart alliance. Their marriage produced several children, but none was as famous or as tragic as Marie Louise. Marie Louise was the second surviving daughter of Philippe and Henriette. Her older sister, Elizabeth Charlotte, known as Liselotte, had already become a prominent figure in the court of Louis XIV, eventually marrying the Duke of Lorraine. But Marie Louise's destiny was to be very different, for she was groomed for a marriage that would cement French influence in Spain. From the earliest years of Marie Louise's childhood, she was taught the ways of the French court. Like most royal children, she was brought up in a sheltered, opulent environment, surrounded by tutors, servants, and the lavishness that defined the life of a princess. However, her existence was far from carefree. The political landscape of 17th century Europe was precarious, and alliances between countries were often sealed through the marriages of royal children. Marie Louise's life was to be shaped not only by her father's ambitions but also by the relentless demands of diplomacy. In 1665, when Marie Louise was only 3 years old, her mother, Henriette of England, died suddenly, an event that left a profound mark on the young princess. Henriette's death, attributed to complications from a fever or possibly poisoning, was a scandal that rocked the court of Louis XIV. Some historians have suggested that her death was part of a larger political plot, while others argue it was simply the result of illness. Regardless, Henriette's passing left Marie Louise without the motherly figure who could have guided her through the complex political and social currents of the French royal court. This loss would impact her in ways she may not have fully understood at the time. Marie Louise grew up under the watchful eye of her father, the Duke of Orleans, and her grandmother, Queen Anne of Austria, who had once been regent of France for the young Louis XIV. Her upbringing was strict, designed to prepare her for her future role as a political pawn in a great European marriage. By the time she was 12 years old, it became clear that her future had already been decided. In 1679, when she was only 17, she was formally betrothed to Charles II of Spain, the sickly and childless King of Spain, in an effort to strengthen ties between France and Spain and to secure the Spanish throne for the Bourbons. At the time of the betrothal, Charles II was already in his 20s, but he was frail and suffering from numerous health issues that had led to his being dubbed the Bewitched by his contemporaries. The Habsburgs had long dominated Spain, but their dynasty was plagued by intermarriage, which resulted in a generation of physically and mentally weak monarchs. Charles II was no exception, suffering from debilitating ailments that made him incapable of producing an heir. The Spanish crown, therefore, looked to the French royal family for a solution. Marie Louise's marriage to Charles II was arranged not only to secure Bourbon claims to the Spanish throne, but also to address the fragile state of the Habsburg dynasty. Despite her youth, Marie Louise was acutely aware of the expectations placed upon her. Her marriage was to be a union of convenience, and it would define much of her life, even before it became a reality. As part of the marriage negotiations, Marie Louise was sent to Spain in 1679, accompanied by an extensive retinue. Her journey was long and arduous, but it was the beginning of a new chapter in her life, one that would be filled with challenges, disappointment, and tragedy. When Marie Louise arrived in Spain, she was met with an array of pomp and ceremony, a testament to the importance of the union between France and Spain. The Spanish court was not without its intrigues and courtly dramas, and Marie Louise quickly learned that the royal house she had joined was deeply divided. Despite her youth, Marie Louise's arrival at the Spanish court marked a turning point in the history of Spain's Bourbon dynasty. She was welcomed as a potential savior of the Spanish Habsburg dynasty, the one who could bring a fresh bloodline to the throne and secure Spain's future. However, the reality of her marriage to Charles II was not as promising as it seemed. Marie Louise's early years in Spain were difficult. She was a foreigner in a strange land, separated from her family and the court of Louis XIV, which she had known all her life. The Spanish court was deeply divided, and Marie Louise found herself caught in the midst of political and personal tensions that would shape her life and ultimately contribute to her premature death at the age of 27. Her health, already fragile from a young age, began to deteriorate further as she struggled to adapt to the Spanish court's environment. Despite these challenges, she was a dutiful wife to Charles II, though her efforts were in vain. The marriage, though it produced no heirs, was seen as a key moment in the ongoing rivalry between the Bourbon and Habsburg dynasties. With the future of Spain hanging in the balance, Marie Louise's story is one of tragedy, sacrifice, and the harsh realities of political life in 17th century Europe. The young princess, who had once been a bright star in the court of her uncle Louis XIV, would ultimately leave a legacy marked by her short life and the failures of her marriage to a sickly and ineffective king. But within the tumult of her time, Marie Louise's life remains a poignant reminder of the sacrifices demanded by royal duty. In the early months of 1679, the courts of Europe were a flurry of political maneuvering. But for Marie Louise d'Orléans, the most significant event of her young life was about to unfold. At the age of 17, she was suddenly at the center of a royal marriage arrangement, one that would alter the course of her life forever. Marie Louise, the lively and charming daughter of the Duke of Orléans, was betrothed to Charles II of Spain, the king whose once vibrant reign had been marred by tragedy, political instability, and the decline of his health. Charles II had ascended to the throne of Spain as a child in 1665. Following the death of his father, Philip IV, the young king was caught in the turbulence of a kingdom on the brink of collapse. Spain, once a dominant power in Europe, was now weakened by decades of warfare, economic decline, and the ongoing internal struggles of the Habsburg dynasty. Charles, plagued by physical and mental infirmities, had grown into a monarch who was often seen as a tragic figure. His inheritance was not just a kingdom but a legacy of inbreeding and disease, which had severely impacted his health. The marriage between Marie Louise and Charles II was orchestrated by the French and Spanish courts as a strategic alliance. At the time, France and Spain were bound by the complex web of dynastic and political interests, and a marriage between the young French princess and the Spanish king was seen as a way to cement ties between the two countries. For Marie Louise, it was not just a union of love or personal desire, but a duty, an arrangement designed to secure the future of both nations and restore Spain's former glory, or at the very least, strengthen its position within Europe. As Marie Louise prepared to leave her home country, the Orléans family, and her familiar life at the French court, she likely felt a mix of trepidation and excitement. At the age of 17, she was still a young woman, and the idea of becoming the queen consort of Spain must have seemed like a fairy tale. However, beneath the gilded promises of royalty lay the harsh realities of court life, political manipulation, and a future that was uncertain at best. Her departure from France was marked by great fanfare, with celebrations and farewell ceremonies held in her honor. As she traveled across Europe toward her new life in Spain, the young princess likely experienced a whirlwind of emotions. The journey was long, fraught with the dangers of travel in an era where disease and banditry were ever present. Still, Marie Louise pressed on, driven by the sense of duty that her royal lineage demanded. At her side were her attendants and advisors, who would help guide her through the complexities of Spanish court life. When Marie Louise finally arrived in Madrid in the summer of 1679, she was greeted with a mix of anticipation and curiosity. The Spanish court, much like the French court, was a place of intrigue and politics. But it was also a world completely different from what she had known. The customs, the language, and the culture were foreign to her, and the transition from the French court, with its lively atmosphere and vibrant social life, to the more somber and austere Spanish court was a shock. Upon meeting her future husband, Charles II, Marie Louise must have been struck by the physical and mental fragility of the king. Charles, who was now in his late teens, was already showing signs of the debilitating illnesses that would plague him throughout his life. His features were often described as weak and delicate, and his body was frail. His speech was slow, and he often had difficulty expressing himself coherently. It was evident that the king's health problems, likely stemming from the extensive inbreeding within the Habsburg family, had taken their toll on him. The royal wedding between Marie Louise and Charles II was a grand affair, one that served as both a personal and political union. The young princess, now the queen consort of Spain, was thrust into the demanding role of a monarch's wife in a foreign land. Her marriage was not based on love or affection, but on the needs of the state. In the Spanish court, she would have had to navigate the complex and often dangerous web of court politics, where allegiances shifted quickly, and the slightest misstep could have disastrous consequences. Despite her initial excitement and the hopes that came with her new role, the reality of life in Spain quickly began to set in. The king's health continued to deteriorate, and his inability to fulfill his royal duties put even greater pressure on Marie Louise. She became a symbol of hope for the Spanish court, a young queen who might one day provide the royal family with an heir to the throne, a child who could carry on the Habsburg name and restore some semblance of stability to the Spanish monarchy. However, the odds were stacked against her. In addition to the challenges of her husband's health, Marie Louise also had to contend with the ongoing political and military struggles that were a constant feature of 17th century Europe. Spain was engaged in costly wars, and the country's economy was faltering. The court, despite its grandeur, was plagued by corruption and factionalism, and Marie Louise found herself caught in the midst of these rivalries, trying to maintain her position and influence in a court where power was often determined by who controlled the king's ear. As the years went on, Marie Louise's role as queen consort became increasingly complex. She was expected to provide an heir, yet Charles II's physical ailments made this a difficult task. In addition to the king's health problems, Marie Louise was confronted with the pressure of maintaining the delicate balance between French and Spanish interests, especially as France, under the rule of King Louis XIV, sought to exert its influence over Spain. Despite these difficulties, Marie Louise remained a figure of elegance and dignity in the Spanish court. Her presence was often seen as a symbol of France's strength and influence, and her beauty and charm won her the admiration of many. However, her health also began to suffer as the strain of court life took its toll. After several years of marriage, it became clear that the hoped for heir would not come, and Marie Louise's position in the Spanish court became increasingly precarious. The next chapters of her life would be marked by personal tragedy and political turbulence. But the early years of her marriage to Charles II were foundational in shaping her legacy as a queen consort in the tumultuous world of 17th century European politics. After her marriage to Charles II of Spain in 1679, Marie Louise d'Orléans found herself catapulted from the vibrant court of France, with its elegance and sophistication, into the decaying grandeur of the Spanish Habsburg monarchy. The Spanish court was a world apart from the lively celebrations she had known at Versailles, where her uncle, King Louis XIV, presided with unmatched authority. The court in Madrid, by contrast, was plagued by political stagnation, internal corruption, and the looming shadow of a monarch whose health and mental state were constantly in question. Upon her arrival in Spain, Marie Louise was overwhelmed by the stark contrast between the French and Spanish courts. Spain, once the greatest power in Europe, had entered a period of decline by the late 17th century. Charles II, her new husband, was in poor health, mentally and physically. His inability to rule effectively had led to a weakening of Spanish influence in European affairs, and his court was characterized by a somber atmosphere of disillusionment. The Spanish monarchy was ruled by a series of regents due to Charles's incapacity to govern. His mother, Mariana of Austria, had served as regent until her death in 1696. But even after her passing, the political landscape remained turbulent. Marie Louise, now the queen consort of Spain, was surrounded by advisors, courtiers, and officials who often sought to manipulate her position for their own political advantage. The Spanish court was a web of intrigue, where the boundaries between loyalty and betrayal were often blurred. Despite the challenges of her new life, Marie Louise tried to make the best of her situation. She maintained her sense of grace and dignity, relying on her upbringing in the French court to navigate the complex dynamics of the Spanish royal family. However, her marriage was not the joyous union she had hoped for. Charles II's physical and mental decline only worsened over time, and their relationship was strained by his inability to consummate their marriage and produce heirs. The failure to have children became a significant source of stress and disappointment for Marie Louise, as the fate of the Spanish Habsburg dynasty hung in the balance. Marie Louise found herself increasingly isolated in the Spanish court, although she had been raised in a world where family ties were of utmost importance. The political reality of her marriage to Charles II was that she was more of a symbol than a partner. Her role was largely ceremonial, and her influence over the affairs of state was minimal. Yet, despite the lack of power and the growing difficulties in her personal life, Marie Louise remained a queen in name, performing her duties with grace and dignity. As the years passed, her physical and emotional health began to deteriorate. The pressures of being married to an ailing king, coupled with the isolation of the Spanish court, took their toll on her. Marie Louise longed for the lively and vibrant atmosphere of the French court, but there was little chance for her to return home. Her duties as queen consort of Spain required her to remain loyal to her husband, despite the challenges they both faced. It was during this period of hardship that Marie Louise's character truly began to emerge. She became known for her resilience and fortitude, qualities that would define her life in the years to come. Though her marriage to Charles II was not a happy one, she remained steadfast in her commitment to her role as queen, despite the difficulties that came with it. Her determination to maintain her dignity in the face of personal and political adversity earned her the respect of many, even if it was not enough to secure her happiness in Spain. In the years following her arrival in Madrid, Marie Louise grew more and more distant from the political intrigues of the court. She devoted herself to religious observance and charitable works, seeking solace in her faith as the tumultuous world around her seemed to crumble. Her marriage to Charles II, once seen as a political alliance of great importance, had become little more than a shadow of its former promise. Yet, even in the face of these hardships, Marie Louise found moments of solace and quiet joy. As the years unfolded in the Spanish court, Marie Louise of Orléans found herself grappling with the dual burdens of being a queen consort and a young woman far from home. Surrounded by a court filled with tension and intrigue, the magnificence of the royal palace in Madrid, with its imposing architecture and luxurious trappings, was often overshadowed by the internal turmoil that marred the reign of her husband, King Charles II. Marie Louise had arrived in Spain with high hopes, although she could not have known just how challenging her new life would be. The Spanish court, once vibrant under the reign of the Habsburgs, had fallen into a long period of decline. Charles II, whom she had married in the hopes of strengthening ties between the French and Spanish monarchies, was a man with numerous physical and mental challenges. His health, deeply compromised by generations of inbreeding, was visibly deteriorating. His incapacity to rule effectively meant that much of the governance of Spain was left in the hands of his advisors, often corrupt and inefficient, and Marie Louise would soon realize the weight of this powerlessness. Her life at court was not only marked by the constant struggle to gain her husband's affections. Charles II had never been an easy man to love, but also by the difficulties of adjusting to the strict, hierarchical structure of the Spanish monarchy. Unlike the lively and somewhat less rigid French court, the Spanish royal family had a tradition of ceremonial grandeur that sometimes alienated its members from the world outside the palace. Despite her royal title, Marie Louise often felt more like a foreigner than a queen. In the early years of her marriage, the young queen faced immense pressure to provide an heir to the throne. The issue of succession was a constant source of tension, and it weighed heavily on both her and Charles II. Yet, as time passed, it became increasingly clear that the couple's chances of producing an heir were slim. Charles II's health was not only fragile but also complicated by his inability to father children, a condition that would later be confirmed as stemming from his numerous inherited disabilities. This personal failure brought Marie Louise under the scrutiny of the court, where rumors about her fertility began to circulate. As much as she tried to maintain her dignity, the failure to bear a child put an emotional strain on her, particularly as the pressures of the Spanish court grew more intense. Her mother-in-law, Queen Mariana of Austria, played a significant role in shaping her life at court, a formidable figure in Spanish politics. Mariana exerted her influence over the young queen, often treating her like a mere pawn in the political game. Yet, Marie Louise was far from a passive player in the drama of her own life. She began to develop a strong sense of self-reliance, and her intelligence and political acumen started to shine through. Still, she was constantly reminded that her position was tenuous at best. The Spanish crown was under threat from multiple factions, and her status as a queen consort with no children only exacerbated her vulnerability. Her personal tragedy, however, did not define her entirely. Marie Louise, despite the pressures, found moments of solace in her devotion to Catholicism, which became her source of strength. She attended Mass regularly and surrounded herself with religious figures who could offer counsel and comfort in times of crisis. Her faith, in many ways, was the anchor that helped her navigate the turbulent waters of the Spanish court. In the meantime, her relationship with Charles II continued to evolve. While their marriage had begun with little affection on his part, over the years, he grew more dependent on her. Even though he was often emotionally distant, there were moments of tenderness, but they were few and far between. The reality of living with a husband who was physically and emotionally distant was a daily struggle for Marie Louise. Yet, despite everything, she remained committed to her role as queen consort, understanding that her duty to Spain transcended her personal disappointments. Her time in Spain, although filled with personal and political challenges, also marked a turning point in Marie Louise's understanding of royal duty. She began to grasp the deeper complexities of governance, often stepping in to assist her husband when the political situation required it. Yet, in the back of her mind, she could not escape the feeling that she had been sent to Spain for a greater purpose, one that was yet to be fulfilled. In the second half of the 1680s, her health began to deteriorate. Some of the stress of her position, combined with the emotional toll of her unfulfilled hopes for a child, took a physical toll on her body. She became ill frequently, and the royal physicians who treated her were unable to give her any lasting relief. By 1689, her health had deteriorated significantly, and she was no longer the vibrant young woman who had first arrived in Spain. Marie Louise's story, though marked by sadness and frustration, was not without its moments of quiet resilience and dignity. She had faced enormous personal challenges with courage, and even though her reign would be cut short, her life had a lasting impact on the Spanish court and her family in France. Marie Louise's death on February 12, 1689, at the age of 26, was a deeply sorrowful moment for the Spanish court. It marked the end of a tragic chapter in the Habsburg monarchy, a reminder of the fragility of royal life. Though she had not been able to fulfill her role as mother to an heir, she left behind a legacy of quiet strength and dedication to her duty. In France, her family mourned her loss deeply, and the French court acknowledged her sacrifices. The death of Marie Louise left Spain without the much-needed succession it so desperately required. Charles II, devastated by the loss of his wife, never truly recovered, and the succession crisis in Spain grew even more urgent in the years that followed. But even in her untimely passing, Marie Louise had shaped the future of both the Spanish and French monarchies. Her name, though often overshadowed by the more grandiose histories of her time, was quietly preserved in the annals of history as a queen who, despite the harsh realities of her life, carried out her duty with grace and perseverance. Her legacy, a blend of personal sacrifice and political significance, lives on in the context of the tumultuous reign of Charles II of Spain and the complex relationship between Spain and France in the late 17th century. Marie Louise d'Orléans' life in Spain, particularly during the late 1680s, can be described as a study in the tension between royal duty and personal despair. As queen consort of Charles II, she was expected to bear the weight of her position, not only in the ceremonial and public sense, but also as a source of hope for the future of the Spanish Habsburg dynasty. Yet, despite her youth, beauty, and noble lineage, Marie Louise faced struggles that would have shattered the spirit of even the most resilient. At the time of her arrival in Spain, Marie Louise had been filled with a mixture of optimism and trepidation. She was, after all, a young woman, just 17 years old, married to a king who, though once charismatic, had become physically frail and mentally unstable. Charles II's health had long been a subject of royal concern, and his marriage to Marie Louise was expected to produce heirs to secure the future of the Habsburg dynasty. However, both Charles and Marie Louise soon found themselves trapped in a reality that neither had fully anticipated. In the early years of her marriage, Marie Louise did what was expected of her. She supported her husband, attended court functions, and played the role of a dutiful queen consort. However, the court of Charles II was far from a glamorous place. It was a court plagued by scandal, gossip, and the specter of an uncertain future. The Spanish crown was in decline, and Charles's inability to produce heirs only added to the anxiety surrounding the monarchy. Despite these pressures, Marie Louise remained a popular figure at court. Her charm, elegance, and beauty made her beloved by the people, and her demeanor was often described as gentle and compassionate. However, as the years passed, it became increasingly clear that the marriage was not likely to produce the desired heir. Charles II, whose health was deteriorating, had little to offer in the way of affection or vitality. His inability to consummate the marriage added to the isolation that Marie Louise felt. Physically, Charles II's condition was appalling, the result of generations of inbreeding among the Habsburgs. His frailty, combined with a series of illnesses and mental instability, made him an unlikely candidate to father children. Marie Louise, who had been raised with the expectation of becoming a mother to future kings, found herself in a position where that hope seemed increasingly remote. Her sense of isolation grew as Charles's condition worsened. Although she had some personal allies at court, including her ladies-in-waiting and a few noble figures, Marie Louise found herself caught in a world that seemed increasingly hostile and detached from her own needs and desires. The Spanish court was known for its political intrigue, and as the queen, she was often a pawn in the larger game of royal diplomacy. But the most profound sorrow for Marie Louise came from her inability to fulfill her most important role, that of a mother. The Spanish court's expectations for a queen were based largely on her ability to produce heirs. And as each year passed without a child, the pressure mounted. Her isolation grew as she increasingly withdrew from the public eye, retreating into the privacy of her chambers. The hope of motherhood, once a bright prospect, turned into a haunting absence that cast a shadow over her life. In addition to her personal suffering, Marie Louise was increasingly aware of the implications of her failure to produce heirs. The Habsburg dynasty was on the verge of collapse, and the king's failure to secure a successor left Spain in a precarious political position. The courtiers who had once praised her beauty and grace began to whisper behind her back, and there were rumors of her inability to conceive being tied to her own health or to Charles's continued decline. In her letters, Marie Louise expressed a sense of profound frustration, yet she rarely spoke of her deep pain in public. She was a queen, after all, and was expected to project an image of strength and dignity. Yet privately, she longed for the companionship of her family in France and for a life free of the burdens of courtly politics. As time went on, Marie Louise's health began to deteriorate, while her mental state remained intact. The physical toll of constant worry, illness, and the absence of children weighed heavily on her. In 1687, she fell seriously ill, suffering from what was diagnosed as a fever. This sickness would prove to be the beginning of a long battle that she would ultimately lose. Despite her struggle to regain her strength, her body remained frail, and the prospect of a recovery became increasingly remote. Her death in 1689 was a tragic end to a life that had been filled with both promise and heartbreak. At the time of her death, Charles II was utterly devastated, though his grief was overshadowed by the fact that the Spanish crown was still without a legitimate heir. Marie Louise's passing marked the end of a chapter in the history of Spain, one that had been fraught with political turmoil and personal tragedy. In her death, Marie Louise left behind a legacy that was bittersweet. Her marriage to Charles II, though childless, had been an attempt to secure the future of the Spanish Habsburg dynasty. Yet, the very failure of that marriage, due to the king's inability to father heirs, would contribute to the eventual decline of the Spanish Empire. For Marie Louise, her final years in Spain were filled with quiet suffering, but they also underscored the immense sacrifices required of queens in royal families, particularly those who were caught in dynastic struggles that often had little regard for personal happiness. In the end, Marie Louise of Orléans' life was a testament to the complexities of royal duty, the challenges of navigating a foreign court, and the enduring pain of unfulfilled hopes. By the year 1688, Marie Louise of Orléans had endured nearly a decade of trials, tribulations, and personal hardships as Queen of Spain. Though she had initially entered the Spanish court with youthful optimism, her marriage to Charles II had proven far more challenging than she could have imagined. While she had been surrounded by the splendor and power of the Spanish monarchy, she had found herself largely isolated, both emotionally and physically, from the court's core. Her husband, Charles II, deeply affected by his own ill health and the weakness of his reign, struggled to fulfill the expectations of a king. And as the years wore on, the couple's inability to produce an heir became a haunting reality for both the monarchy and for Marie Louise herself. Her health, already fragile upon her arrival in Spain, had been further strained by the constant pressure of living in a court that was both politically unstable and physically inhospitable. The harsh Spanish climate, the rigorous demands of court life, and the ever-present sense of loneliness contributed to her gradual physical and mental decline. Yet it was not simply the environment that led to her deterioration. Rather, it was the emotional and psychological toll of living in a marriage that had long been devoid of love and fulfillment. The relationship with Charles, while polite and respectful, lacked the intimacy that she had hoped for. It was clear that her husband's health issues and his deep depression only added to the weight of the situation. Despite these hardships, Marie Louise remained committed to her duties as queen consort. She took on public roles with grace and dignity, attending royal events, supporting charitable causes, and trying to reassure the Spanish people that their queen was still strong. Despite her physical frailty, in these public appearances, she donned the royal regalia with a composed expression, hiding the pain and despair that had begun to overwhelm her in private moments. One of the greatest sources of sorrow for Marie Louise was her inability to bear an heir to the Spanish throne. This had been the ultimate goal of her marriage, to secure the future of the Habsburg dynasty in Spain. Yet, after years of effort, no children came. The pressure from both her husband and the Spanish court grew unbearable. The failure to produce an heir was not just a personal sorrow, it was a political catastrophe, as it threatened the stability of Spain's monarchy. Marie Louise's fragile health only worsened in the late 1680s. She had long suffered from a series of illnesses, many of which were exacerbated by the harsh conditions of the Spanish court. In the summer of 1688, she fell gravely ill, and it became apparent to those around her that the Queen's end was near. The royal physicians, who had treated her for years, were unable to offer any solution to her deteriorating condition. She spent her final days in a state of physical and emotional exhaustion, surrounded by her closest attendants and her husband, who, though devoted, was equally ill and unable to provide much comfort. In the final weeks of her life, Marie Louise was forced to come to terms with the reality that her dreams of a legacy through her children would never come to fruition. The pressure of this realization weighed heavily on her, and it is said that she often spent her days in quiet reflection, reflecting on the sacrifices she had made for the Spanish throne and the role she had played in the dynastic politics of Europe. Marie Louise passed away on February 12, 1689, at the age of 26, a tragic and premature end to a life filled with both promise and unfulfilled potential. Her death marked the end of an era for the Spanish court, and her absence was deeply mourned by those who had known her, both within Spain and abroad. Charles II, already weakened by his own chronic illnesses, was devastated by the loss of his wife. The court was thrown into mourning, and the king withdrew further into his isolation, a man crushed by the combined weight of his own physical ailments and the loss of his queen. Spain, though a mighty empire, had suffered a grievous blow, as the monarchy was now left without a clear heir. The royal line of succession remained uncertain, and Marie Louise's death only added to the already fragile state of the Spanish throne. While her reign as Queen Consort of Spain had been fraught with challenges, Marie Louise of Orléans left behind a complex legacy. She had been a symbol of royal diplomacy, a young woman who had been married off to secure political alliances between two powerful European nations. Yet, despite her personal sacrifices and her dedication to her role as queen, her time in Spain had been marked by unfulfilled dreams, illness, and isolation. Her untimely death marked the end of an era for the Spanish court, and her legacy would forever remain entwined with the tragic history of the Habsburg monarchy. The year was 1689, and the court of Spain was an ever-dimming reflection of the once vibrant kingdom that had welcomed Marie Louise of Orléans into its fold a decade earlier. Time had not been kind to the young queen. Her marriage, initially a symbol of hope for the Spanish Habsburg dynasty, had slowly turned into a poignant narrative of sacrifice, isolation, and quiet resignation. It was in these final years that Marie Louise's legacy would begin to solidify, not through the achievements she had hoped to claim, but through the resilience she had shown in the face of adversity. Born into the opulent world of French royalty, Marie Louise had always known that her life would be dictated by duty, diplomacy, and the ever-watchful eyes of the court. But nothing could have prepared her for the harsh reality of her new life in Spain. When she married Charles II of Spain in 1679, she was only 17, full of youthful hopes and expectations. She was a daughter of the House of Orléans, a branch of the French royal family, and her marriage to the troubled King of Spain was seen as a union that could strengthen the ties between two powerful nations. First, the marriage seemed to hold promise. Marie Louise was welcomed in Madrid with grand celebrations and a lavish court. She was beautiful, charming, and possessed a grace that captivated the Spanish nobility. Yet behind the glittering facade, the marriage was fraught with difficulties. Charles II, suffering from severe health issues and lacking the vitality required for ruling a kingdom, was unable to provide the kind of partnership Marie Louise had hoped for. The couple's union was childless, a fact that brought immense pressure on Marie Louise, both from her husband and from the Spanish court. The failure to produce an heir was not just a personal disappointment. It was seen as a national crisis, one that threatened the very future of the Habsburg dynasty in Spain. As time wore on, Marie Louise's hopes for a happy marriage and a meaningful reign faded. She found herself increasingly isolated, a young queen trapped in a kingdom that was falling apart around her. The Spanish court was riddled with political intrigue, factionalism, and corruption, and Charles II, while well-meaning, was often too weak to provide the kind of leadership his country so desperately needed. The Queen, despite her royal status, had little power to effect real change. In the midst of this turmoil, Marie Louise's health began to deteriorate. Perhaps it was the stress of her marriage, the pressure of living in an alien court, or the emotional toll of years of disappointment. But her once radiant beauty began to fade. Chronic illnesses, including tuberculosis, took a toll on her body, and by 1689, she was a shadow of her former self. Her physical decline mirrored the slow unraveling of her hopes for a better life. Throughout all of this, Marie Louise remained a queen in name, but not in spirit. Her correspondence with her family in France became more frequent, as she longed for the familiar comforts of her homeland. Yet even this connection was a reminder of the distance that now separated her from the world she once knew. Despite the love and loyalty of her French relatives, there was little they could do to ease her suffering. In her final days, Marie Louise's thoughts turned inward. She had been a queen without an heir, a woman married to a man who could not provide the stability she had hoped for, and a symbol of a royal union that had failed to live up to its expectations. Yet, despite her personal tragedies, she maintained a dignity that would come to define her legacy. Her devotion to the Spanish court, to her duties as queen, and to her role as a symbol of dynastic unity never wavered, even when the circumstances seemed insurmountable. Her death on February 12, 1689, came as a quiet end to a life marked by profound challenges. At the time of her passing, her husband, Charles II, was deeply affected, though his own failing health and his isolation from Marie Louise in the later years of their marriage meant that their emotional connection had dwindled. Charles II, devastated by the loss, would live only a few more years, passing away in 1700, the last of the Habsburgs to sit on the Spanish throne. In the wake of her death, the Spanish court mourned the passing of a queen who had never truly been able to fulfill the role for which she had been destined. While Marie Louise had never given birth to an heir, her memory endured as a symbol of loyalty, sacrifice, and the harsh realities of royal life. The Spanish Habsburg dynasty, plagued by inbreeding and a lack of viable heirs, would soon face its own downfall. The death of Charles II and the subsequent War of Spanish Succession would alter the course of European history. Marie Louise's legacy, while not marked by political triumphs or the birth of heirs, would be remembered for her quiet strength in the face of adversity. She had been a queen who had carried the weight of her royal title with grace, even when it seemed that fate had dealt her a cruel hand. In the end, her life was a testament to the often overlooked sacrifices of royal women, whose roles in history are often defined not by their personal achievements, but by their endurance in the face of overwhelming challenges. Her story, though brief, remains one of poignant beauty and quiet tragedy, a reminder of the complexities of royal life, the personal cost of political unions, and the often hidden struggles faced by women in positions of power. The history of Marie Louise of Orleans is not one of victory, but of survival and the bittersweet legacy she left behind.